morning, and I'll invite everyone to grab their last cup of coffee, get a snack, and settle in for what will be a wonderful day of exploring the life and art of Grandma Moses. And I was just out in the lobby saying, this is such a Grandma Moses kind of day out there. This is the kind of the day she might have packed in her memory and then put down in an exploration of her world. So be comfortable. We're going to provide plenty of time throughout the day to stretch and get snacks. We've got presentations. Each presentation will be followed by a short break. And then at the end of the afternoon, we invite you all to join us for a tour of the exhibition. I'm sure some or many of you may have already seen it, but you will get a chance to see it again through new eyes. I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Firstly, I wanted to thank our speakers for joining us today. I wanted to thank RETN, the Regional Educational Television Network, for joining us, capturing all of this experience, and for future broadcast. I wanted to thank the education team who worked very tirelessly to put all of this together. If you have, I tend to be loud and hopefully everyone can hear me, but every speaker is different. So if you wish to have listening assistance, there are these devices which are in the stand just to my right behind, over near the table. You can use one of these and you should be able to get sufficient amplification. There's just a knob right on the back. The only thing you need to do is turn them on and use the earpiece. Thank you very much, Angelica. And then in the shameless promotion category, there are wonderful books both by Jane Collier and others for sale in the museum store later today. And if you haven't seen it, this is the catalog of this exhibition, Grandma Moses American Modern. We'll have a copy for you to review out at the registration table today, and those are also available for purchase in the museum store. Hopefully everyone has found the restrooms. Restrooms are in the coat room. There's a single stall there, and then men's and women's rooms are downstairs on the lower level. You can take the stairs, or there is an elevator to the lower level as well. If you haven't muted your cell phones, now would be a great time to do that. And I'm going to do the same. I realize mine is in my pocket, and so that way we can all enjoy our conversation collectively without further electronic intrusion than we already produce. Any other preliminary questions about details? The materials that you have in front of you include a schedule, a list of attendees, or a list of most of the attendees. We've had some wonderful folks join us. A speaker biographies and a bibliography of works both that we have for sale in the museum store as well as a number of other works that explore Grandma Moses and modernist art. And with that, again, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn the podium over to our director, Tom Dennenberg, to start the day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on a glorious fall day in Vermont. In 1947, our founder, Electra Havemeyer-Webb, wrote that she wanted this museum, to be an educational institution, varied and alive. So we like to turn to symposia in the fall. We like to turn to program. We like to double down on content as we move into the fall with exhibitions and education programs like the one that we will have today. We're here to amplify the themes explored in Grandma Moses American Modern. We're here to celebrate Grandma Moses. Many of you know from other programs at the museum this summer that Grandma Moses, in fact, celebrated her 100th birthday at Shelburne Museum, so there's a long institutional history with Grandma Moses, and we want to hold her up again as an important practitioner of visual culture in New England. And I want to talk a little bit for a moment about the very title of this exhibition, Grandma Moses, American Modern, because the title itself is intentional, and semantics are important when it comes to titles. Grandma. Initially, Jamie and I entertained the idea of employing Anna Mary Robertson Moses as a standard throughout the exhibition and the catalog to sort of give her her name back and take back the identity from the nickname that was bestowed on her by a New York critic early on in her career. And we jettisoned that fairly soon, though, because we decided that the phenomenon of Grandma Moses is as important today as it was in the 1940s. American. This may go without saying, but the 1930s and 40s were an era of profound abrasion in the social fabric of the United States, the Great Depression, World War II, and critics and scholars and artists and writers literally created a cottage industry asking the question, what is American about American art? And Grandma Moses is a wonderful example of that process. Modern. And this is where it gets a little interesting. Modern is one of these T-shaped ideas that lets us discuss modernism, which we can sort of use as a shorthand for an aesthetic category that marked the sea change from sentimental culture of the 19th century to modernist culture about the self and about alienation of the 20th century. It's T-shaped because it lets us talk about modernism, and it also lets us talk about modernity. And by modernity, I want to sort of offer that up as the experience of the modern era, which for years we thought of as kind of a process or almost a cultural conveyor belt. We're all on the way to modernity. We're going somewhere together. Now today we recognize modernity is very contingent on lived experience, individual experience. We know that a poor farmer's modernity from a little west of the Vermont border is very different from advertising executive's modernity in 1940s New York. But taken together, they form a culture in the 1940s and 50s, and it is that culture that we want to explore today with our wonderful speakers. This project had a kind of odd genesis. Where's Robert? In the middle. Robert Waltersdorf and I have known each other for many years, the director of the Bennington Museum, and we were batting ideas back and forth for how do we do something together. This is a small state, Vermont, but curiously there are distinct regions, and I don't know, it's been some years since the Bennington Museum and Shelburne Museum collaborated on a project. That was a furniture show many, many years ago. And so it was time to do something again to knit together our institutions. We both enjoyed the irony that you could walk down the street in Cleveland or Chicago or Des Moines and ask anyone on the street and they will probably tell you that Grandma Moses was from Vermont, even though she wasn't. But somehow or other in the popular imagination, popular understanding, received understanding in this country, Bennington Museum and Shelburne Museum somehow reinforced this idea over the years that Grandma Moses is our artist in Vermont. Both institutions have a long institutional history with Grandma Moses. I mentioned Grandma Moses literally cut the birthday cake here. In the summer of 1960, August of 1960, Electra Webb staged a retrospective of the work of Grandma Moses to celebrate her centennial, and purchased 4 paintings out of that exhibition, which are in the permanent collection of Shelburne Museum. A 5th painting had been given to Electra Webb by Grandma Moses in the Christmas of 1957, so they had an ongoing relationship, and Electra Webb's correspondence reflects the warmth that she felt for Grandma Moses. After Grandma Moses passed away, Bennington Museum became the institutional home of Grandma Moses, and that process has everything to do with the Gallery St. Etienne and Jane's grandfather, Otto Collier. Because in the 1960s, Bennington Museum was a destination for people coming to find this sort of authentic old New England, and Grandma Moses was really first among equals of the artists who were providing that sort of visual mythology. We could not have done this exhibition without Jane Collier and the Gallery St. Etienne. And it is my great, great pleasure to introduce Jane to you as our first speaker today. Jane is a graduate of Brown University, and she has curated exhibitions for numerous museums throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia. In addition to Anna Mary Robertson, Grandma Moses, her areas of expertise include John Kane, Egon Schiele, Gustav Klimt, Leonard Baskin, and Sue Coe. Clear has authored more than 20 publications, including Grandma Moses in the 21st Century and The Essential Grandma Moses, and numerous magazine and catalog essays. Her writings have won national awards and international awards, and her service to the art community includes leadership positions in the Art Dealers Association of America, where she served and has served on the board of directors. Jane has been a good friend of this institution, a great friend of the Bennington Museum, a generous colleague answering numerous late in the afternoon questions about Grandma Moses as we put the catalog together. And please join me in welcoming Jane Clear back to Shelburne, where she has been before, where she will lead off our discussion of the art and life of Grandma Moses today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that great introduction. I will try to live up to all of those accolades. And good morning, everyone. My role today is to sort of lead off by giving you a broad introduction to Grandma Moses. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking first a little bit about her life, and then we'll talk about her art to set the stage for our subsequent speakers. Anna Mary Robertson was born in 1860 in what she called the green meadows and wild woods of a farm in Washington County, which is located not in Vermont, but about 10 miles west of Bennington and just northeast of Albany, New York. Her father, Russell King Robertson, had a flax mill there. Anna Mary described Russell as, quote, a farmer and inventor, a dreamer, a believer in beauty and refinement. Her mother, Mary Shanahan Robertson, was made of sterner stuff. Mrs. Robertson believed it was her children's duty to help with work around the farm, and little girls had to be taught to sew and cook at a young age. The rural school was open only 3 months in the summer and 3 in winter, and girls were often kept home in the colder months. From an early age, Anna Mary loved to draw. Sometimes her father would give his children colored chalks and paper as a treat, saying that it lasted longer than candy. And in school, when the students had to draw maps, the teacher always lavished special praise on Anna Mary's efforts. Of course, Mrs. Robertson considered all of this a foolish waste of time. Although the artist Grandma Moses later remembered her childhood as a happy period, life was tough on a farm in the late 19th century. 3 of Anna Mary's 5 brothers and 5 sisters wouldn't live into adulthood. Mother was always very matter-of-fact, the artist later wrote, and she said, "As you are born, you must die," and Father took it that way too. Like all farmers, the family was economically dependent on the vicissitudes of weather and just plain luck. The Moseses weren't well off, and so when she was 12, Anna Mary was sent to work as a hired girl on a neighboring farm, cooking for and taking care of a wealthier family. She'd continue to do this type of work on various farms for the next 15 years. Anna Mary Robertson was relatively old for those times, 27 when she married. Maybe young men found her fierce independence off-putting. And while it's hard for us, who well know the photos of frail old Grandma Moses, to imagine this, Anna Mary, as a young woman, was, in her own words, heavy in the sit-down. At any rate, in 1887, Thomas Salmon Moses, conveniently enough, a hired man on the same farm as Anna Mary, proposed marriage. Of their romance, Anna Mary later wrote simply that she found Thomas to be, quote, temperate and thrifty, adding bluntly, so many of the boys were chicken thieves. This was the era of post-Civil War Reconstruction, and Thomas Moses, like many Northerners, had heard that there were great economic opportunities to be had in the South. Within an hour of their wedding, the couple was on a train heading for North Carolina, where Thomas had been promised a job on a horse ranch. However, he and Anna Mary stopped overnight in Stanton, Virginia, where they were persuaded to go no farther. At first, the Moseses worked as tenant farmers on other people's land, but eventually they saved up enough to buy their own property. This painting here shows the Dudley place, which is one of several farms where the Moses family lived. It was hard work, but Anna Mary always did her best to contribute to the household economy. Not like some girls, she later wrote, they sit down and then somebody has to throw sugar at them. We were a team, she said of her marriage. With her savings, Anna Mary bought her own cow, and she made butter, which she sent for cash or trade to the local grocery. Later, when funds were short, she made and sold potato chips. Anna Mary Moses had 10 children, half of whom were stillborn or died in early infancy. Her namesake, Anna, whom you see in this photo, died of TB as a young woman. In the end, Grandma Moses would outlive all her children but 2. Anna Mary Moses loved the South, the gentle climate and the feeling in the Blue Ridge Mountains of being on top of the world. Compared to that, she said, New York's Adirondack Mountains felt like a swamp. But Thomas was homesick, and in 1905, he convinced his wife to return north. The family got a fair price for their Virginia property, and with the proceeds were able to buy a farm in Eagle Bridge, New York, not far from where Anna Mary had been born. She called that farm Mount Nebo, after the biblical mountain where Moses disappeared. And it was here, in 1927, that Thomas Moses died of a heart attack and left Anna Mary's world. In the years between childhood and her husband's death, Anna Mary Moses had had little time for art. Raising her children and taking care of the farm were full-time occupations. Nonetheless, she always tried to make things pretty around the house. Sometimes, as here, she'd decorate useful objects with paint. You'll recall that I said a moment ago that her father, Russell King Robertson, encouraged her interest in art as a child, and in fact, he also painted a little. In Robertson's picture, you can see the influence of 19th century American landscape painting, and one might imagine that Russell was aware of the work of the Hudson River School of Painters. Anna Mary remembered that once, after a particularly hard winter, her father had painted a spring landscape on the parlor walls. It's perhaps no coincidence, then, that her first full-scale pictorial effort was also a sort of wall painting. She painted this work in 1918 because she'd run out of wallpaper for the parlor and needed to decorate the board that traditionally is used to cover the fireplace when it isn't being used in the summer. Anna Mary's fireboard is noticeably more primitive than her father's painting, but like his, it has the muted brownish palette that you sometimes see in 19th century landscape paintings and early chromolithographic reproductions. Moses's first extended foray into art, however, wasn't made with paint, but with worsted yarn. Not long after Thomas's death, she went to Bennington to help care for her daughter Anna, who was already terminally ill with tuberculosis. Anna had seen an embroidered picture somewhere, and she asked her mother to make one like it. Moses complied, and when people admired the embroidery, she made more. But her hands were so stiff with arthritis that she found it difficult to hold a needle and yarn. One day, her sister suggested that she try painting instead. So I did, Moses recounted. I painted for pleasure, to keep busy, and to pass the time away. But I thought no more of it than of doing fancy work. Soon, however, she had more pictures than she knew what to do with, more than she could give away to friends and family, more than any one person could really handle. So she took a few to the local country fair, along with her canned fruits and jellies, which she was accustomed to exhibiting. I won a prize for my fruit and jam, she sardonically noted, but no pictures. Then Carolyn Thomas, the widow of the druggist in the neighboring village of Hoosick Falls, asked Moses to contribute to a women's exchange that she was organizing at the drugstore. This was during the Depression, and Mrs. Thomas wanted to help local homemakers by giving them an outlet to sell things that they'd made. Moses's paintings languished in that drugstore window for quite a bit of time, gathering dust, until one day, during the Easter holiday of 1938, a New York collector named Louis Calder chanced through Hoosick Falls. Calder was a roving engineer for the New York State Water Department, and on his travels, he liked to pick up local arts and crafts. He saw Moses's paintings in the drugstore window, asked to see more, and ended up buying the whole lot. Then he got Moses's address from the druggist, and he went to see her in person. Moses was astounded when Calder offered to buy everything she had on hand. He did more than that, though. He sent her better paints and brushes and encouraged her in the pursuit of a hobby that she and most of her family were increasingly inclined to see as frivolous. Even if you do not do it for anyone else, I will be only too happy if you keep on painting for me alone, Calder wrote her. For I always feel that sooner or later I will be able to publicly justify my opinion of you and bring you some measure of respect and recognition for your efforts. Calder began making the rounds of New York galleries with Moses's work, but dealers always balked when they heard the artist's age. In 1938, Moses was 78, and her life expectancy made it hard to justify the cost and effort of mounting an exhibition. In 1939, Calder had his first limited success. He convinced Sidney Janis, who would later become a dealer, but who was then a collector and a trustee of the fledgling Museum of Modern Art, to include some of Moses's work in a show of quote-unquote contemporary unknown painters at the museum. But that exhibition, held in MoMA's members' room, wasn't open to the general public. It had no real resonance, and when it closed, all the artist got was a polite thank you note. Then, in early 1940, Calder came to see my grandfather, Otto Kallir. My grandfather had immigrated to New York from his native Austria, which he had been forced to leave after Hitler's Anschluss in 1938. In Vienna, Kallir had run the leading gallery for modern art, but like many early patrons of the avant-garde, he also had an appreciation for folk art and the work of self-taught painters. Modern artists were at that time engaged in a conscious rejection of academic orthodoxy, and so they sought inspiration from the work of artists who, like Moses, had of necessity been denied formal training. This art seemed purer and more genuine than most academic art. Kallir wasn't put off by Moses's age. He liked the work and almost immediately agreed to give the artist a one-woman show. He called that show simply What a Farm Wife Painted. The artist's name, after all, was completely unknown, and so it didn't seem significant at the time. Moses declined to attend the opening at Kallir's Gallery Saint-Étienne. Why bother, she asked him. October was a busy time on the farm, and besides, she'd already seen all the paintings. But when, in November, Gimmel's department store decided to reassemble the exhibition for a special Thanksgiving festival, Moses agreed to come. I guess she'd heard of Gimbel's. Moses arrived in New York with Carolyn Thomas in tow. Mrs. Thomas, the lady from the drugstore, clearly felt that she deserved all the credit for having discovered the artist. Moses was asked to address a large crowd, including the press and the general public, at Gimbel's auditorium. Maybe remembering her experience at the country fair, she talked about her fruit and jam, not her paintings. Everyone was totally charmed to see that the artist herself was as unpretentious and original as her work. It was at that moment that the legend of Grandma Moses was born. The name Grandma Moses, by the way, was given to the artist around that time by a journalist. Or rather, I should say more accurately, a journalist learned that that was one of her nicknames, used it in an article, and it stuck. Moses was a matriarch and had been one for many years already. In Virginia, she'd been known as Mother Moses, and as she aged, it was natural that friends and family would gradually begin to refer to her as Grandma Moses. But Grandma Moses wasn't, as is sometimes said, an overnight sensation. The turning point in her career really came in 1946, 6 years after that first show at Saint Etienne. It was in 1946 that the first Grandma Moses Christmas cards were issued and the first monograph on the artist, Grandma Moses American Primitive, appeared. The initial announcement of the cards produced orders for many thousands more than had initially been anticipated, and the book became a bestseller. From then on, Moses was a national and soon an international celebrity. In 1949, she met the president. And in 1955, Moses was interviewed by the famous television journalist Edward R. Murrow. In many ways, Moses was the first artist to become a media superstar. Television was still in its infancy. Live remote radio broadcasts, which made it possible for the world to hear Moses' voice from Eagle Bridge, were still a new technological marvel. Color TV was also new and rare. It was considered a big deal that on the Murrow program, Moses' paintings were shown in color, even though most Americans at the time only owned black and white sets. A number of complex factors accounted for Moses' success. Her works spoke directly to the American public through greeting cards, reproductions, and the media, and certainly not least through countless exhibitions of the originals. In this manner, she circumvented the more elitist institutions of the traditional art world. At a time when abstract expressionism was in its ascendancy and many Americans felt alienated by modern art, Moses offered a simple, down-home alternative. Maybe more to the point, at the dawn of the Cold War era, she offered a reassuring vision of hope. Her paintings didn't advocate a nostalgic return to the past, but rather presented past and present as a single, unbroken and unbreakable continuum. Moses' message was that the most meaningful values of the past are eternal and thus will never fade. Memory and hope, as she herself put it, were the keys to her art. By looking backward, Grandma Moses endeavored to guarantee and safeguard the future. Moses' fame rested on more than a cute story. In fact, though her media appearances were for their day spectacular, they were few and far between. Grandma rarely left Eagle Bridge. Her simple lifestyle never changed, and she didn't make herself regularly available to the media circus or join the New York art scene. Above all else, Moses' fame was grounded in the art. Those art dealers who'd rejected Moses on account of her age shouldn't have been so worried. She lived to be 101, and her fame only increased year by year. Her 100th and then her 101st birthdays were celebrated almost like national holidays. When she died in 1961, She was eulogized all over the world as a unique artistic phenomenon. And although the cult of personality has inevitably faded over these last 55 years, Grandma Moses remains one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. The style she invented is, to this day, a staple of children's book illustration. Indeed, she spawned so many imitators that sometimes it's hard to remember that before Moses, the cute, folksy style we come to think of as primitive hardly existed. Therefore, it's worth asking, just how did this little old lady with scant schooling of any kind and no art world connections manage to become so popular and so influential? Just where did that famous Grandma Moses style come from, and what accounts for its enduring appeal? Like many self-taught artists, Anna Mary Moses began by looking at those visual images that were readily available to her. And Currier and Ives, which was, I would say, her foremost inspiration, is very well represented here in Shelburne. So if you're going around the museum later today, I think you can sort of really see encapsulated in this space Moses's roots. In addition to Currier and Ives, of course, Moses, like any visual person, was very, very appreciative of magazine illustrations, greeting cards, and other imagery that she had available to her in her general environment. These became her substitutes for art school. Nevertheless, if you look closely at her painting on the right here, you can see that even in an early copy like this, she infected a stylistic transformation that made the Currier and Ives imagery all her own. Colors were muted and made more expressive, and forms were simplified. As Moses continued to paint, she became increasingly dissatisfied with the traditional kinds of illustrations that she was copying. The compositions in her source images, like most Western representational art since the Renaissance, were based on the idea of single-point perspective. That is to say, the viewer is asked to imagine a subject as though it is being seen from a single vantage point. And that approach basically gives the artist the choice of focusing either on the background or on the foreground of a scene, but not both at once. The painting on the right is more or less a direct copy of the clipping on the left. Note how in both of these compositions, foreground detail upstages and almost obliterates the background. In this clipping, on the other hand, foreground detail is sacrificed in favor of a more panoramic view. The tree provides scale, but the primary focus is on the valley beyond. Conventional single-point perspective presents an either-or choice. Moses, however, wanted to have both foreground and background detail in her paintings. She didn't see why an artist should be limited to just what's visible to the naked eye. Why shouldn't an artist paint everything that she or he knows to be present in a scene? So now, if you look at this painting, you'll see that Moses has actually combined the two clippings that we just saw. Click back for a second. So here's the tree, here's the house, click, click, and now you have a composition that combines the close-up of both, the cottage and the panoramic view of the valley. By 1942, the artist had evolved her own unique approach to composition and developed what we have since come to think of as the classic Grandma Moses style. The landscape view here is pulled apart, as if seen through a fisheye camera lens. Moses creates a quilt-like panorama, stretching the landscape in a manner that allows her to incorporate foreground detail as well as the feeling of an infinite view seen from on high. With better brushes and growing mastery of the medium, she's also better able to abstract and simplify pictorial detail, as you can see on the right. My grandfather considered this painting, Black Horses, to be a turning point in Moses's development. Upon seeing it for the first time, he realized that Grandma Moses had become a great artist. But even when Moses had hit her stride stylistically, she didn't abandon the use of printed sources. And in the exhibition here at Shelburne, you can see a very, very small collection of these sources, of which she had literally thousands. She stopped, however, copying pre-existing compositions, and her way of using the printed sources changed. She'd rummage through this large collection of clippings, which she'd culled from books and magazines and greeting cards, and she'd get inspiration for a painting, pulling out little bits and pieces that she thought might fit together. Then she'd move the clippings around until she felt that she had a pleasing arrangement, and she'd copy them into place on the masonite board that was her preferred support. This drawing, combining aspects of the two clippings you just saw, functioned as a kind of template used to transfer the chosen vignette to the artist's support. As you can see, Moses copies only the outlines from the clippings, losing in the process all representational detail. Go back for a bit, forward again. And so here you can see how everything fits into the final painting. When she went to paint in those outlines, she did so completely from her own imagination. So the forms become pure abstraction, and colors were chosen to suit her own expressive desires and according to the color requirements of the overall composition. Although many of Moses's paintings evoke the rural life of bygone days, her approach was symbolic, not slavishly literal. And that's because in stripping away all specific detail from her printed sources, Moses also stripped away all specifically illustrative references to the past. And this kept her paintings from succumbing to nostalgia or sentimentality. The artist's stylized characters can evoke the past only in the broadest, most general way. The abstract characters rather become universal ciphers with whom everyone can identify. If Moses's clipping collection provided one pictorial source, another equally important stylistic influence derived from the artist's experiences with embroidery. Unlike paint on a palette, colored yarn can't be mixed and blended. Each strand remains discrete unto itself, and subtle color effects have to be achieved by juxtaposing multiple strands. The texture of the yarn allows for three basic effects. Color can be applied in broad swaths, laid out in lines, or stitched into bud-like knots. And you can see all three of those effects in this embroidery and also in this painting. Basically, embroidery taught Grandma Moses what the Impressionists had learned through optical theory, to break forms down into their component colors. Also from embroidery, Moses acquired a feeling for texture. Often she tried to give her brushstrokes a three-dimensional presence that imitated the feeling of yarn stitchery. Her sensitivity to the textures of paint meshed with her feeling for abstract form. These textures, at least in the early phases of her career, were not the wild painterly textures of the expressionist painter, but rather the neat, clean textures of embroidery and applique. Her simple forms and shapes almost seem to be sewn into place. Her ability to proceed from the realistic to the abstract, to conceive, for example, of this distant city on the right, for example, as a complex of little rectangles, is really breathtaking in its daring and originality. And unfortunately, I don't have a laser pointer, but this vignette, which you see in close-up on the right, is in the upper right-hand corner of this painting, Hoosick Valley from the Window, which is also in the exhibition here at Shelburne. So we've seen two of the three major sources for the Grandma Moses style: the clipping collection, embroidery, but the third, and in many ways the most important source of her artistic vision, was nature itself. If the characters and the vignettes in Moses's paintings are essentially generic abstractions, her landscapes are quite specific. The figures may allude to the past, but the landscapes are very much of the present. This, then, is the crucial stylistic link. Memory and hope, the artist's philosophical credo, is concretely expressed in her stylistic choices. By connecting the past with the present, the abstract with the naturalistic, Moses affirms her faith in the future. Moses was an acute observer of the colors and moods of the various times of year and types of weather. Here, she captures the chill, bare trees of a northern winter with startling accuracy. You can almost feel the frozen stillness, smell the damp cold, and hear the whoosh of the birds as they rise from the riverbank, startled by the crack of the hunters' guns. Moses's sure feeling for natural phenomena is probably most obvious in her storm scenes, because here the weather exaggerates the natural effects. In this painting of a thunderstorm, for example, every aspect of the oncoming torrent is captured in graphic detail. The parched fields and hills of a hot August afternoon, the verdant trees snapping in the wind, the lowering clouds and gradually darkening sky. Closer to home, a frenzied horse tears through the fields, and a girl runs for shelter. And while the horse seems wildly mobile, the girl is almost frozen in midair, and the two kids to her left seem completely oblivious to everything. So the painting manages to convey almost cinematically the different stages of the approaching storm and its differing impact on the various participants. Of all her many subjects, the one that Moses liked least was interiors. She did them occasionally and on request, but with reluctance. She far preferred a landscape, or as she put it, a scene that leads me on and on into the unknown. Though her interiors, by comparison with the landscapes, seem a bit stiff and constrained, many people admire them for their abstract and folky quality. The interiors, in fact, are the most stereotypically primitive of Moses's works. Her willingness to tackle interiors, indeed to rise to any challenge, regardless of her initial reservations, speaks to Moses's love of such experiences. She never remained stagnant in her work. unlike many self-taught artists who, partly under pressure from the marketplace, start repeating themselves once they've hit on a successful formula, Moses was continually developing. It's easiest to examine Moses's development if we look at the treatment of a subject, sugaring off, that she painted repeatedly over the course of her 20-year career. Now, here in Vermont, you're all familiar with sugaring off, I assume. In the late winter or early spring, as the sap begins to run in the maple trees are tapped, the sap is drawn out, and then it's boiled into maple sugar or syrup. The communal nature of this enterprise, the many activities involved, and their intrinsic quaintness made sugaring off a common artistic subject, one that was featured frequently in popular illustrations, including the Currier and Ives lithograph that you see on the left. And Moses was always attracted to pictorial traditions that reflected events she'd personally experienced. Sugaring off was a ritual that she'd known since early childhood. The 1940 sugaring painting that you see on the right is closely related to the Currier and Ives lithograph, although, as usual, Moses added her own compositional modifications and considerably opened up the background landscape. Just a few years later, Moses had evolved her signature style, and this is the same style that we saw exemplified earlier on in the painting Black Horses. This 1943 sugaring is, again, one of the paintings that you can see here at the Shelburne exhibition. And you can note, again, how the broad, almost square format facilitates a quilt-like panorama. A myriad small details and activities are spread out across a wide expanse, and diminishing scale is used, albeit inconsistently, to position the various vignettes in space. Moses knew that things get smaller as you recede into the distance, even if she didn't know the conventional rules of perspective. Moses's rendering of figures has also become much more refined, as is amply evidenced in this comparison of the same vignette from the 1940 and 1943 sugarings. With greater precision and control, the artist now manages to create cleaner, more concise forms without sacrificing detail. And we can follow this image of the sleigh in later sugarings. As you can see, Moses's style loosened as she aged. Her figures now become less precisely detailed, more abstract. Toward the end of her life, Moses's brushstrokes became very loose, almost expressionistic. In this 1961 sugaring, shapes are fluid rather than flat. The little vignettes begin to merge with the background, and both become integral components in a network of pigment and color. Moses has also dropped the squarish, quilt-like format in favor of a narrower horizontal that further facilitates the expressive compression of her images. Moses's last finished painting, Rainbow, is ample testament to her developmental arc. Color here is the dominant element. Form, freed by looser brushwork, is more purely abstract than ever before. Moses's Rainbow is a celebration of life, a triumphant outpouring of the human spirit that's intensified by the expressive force of her late style. Indeed, it's fitting that Moses's storybook career should have such a picture-perfect ending. For Rainbow is not only masterful in its own right, it also serves as an ideal farewell message for an artist whose central theme was hope. As one collector of the artist's work a physician who happens to specialize in geriatrics, put it, at the age of 101, and after all she'd endured, Grandma Moses was still painting rainbows. Thank you very much.